You have spent years arguing with people who were never going to update their position. You have explained, you have clarified, you have cited primary sources, you have walked through your reasoning step by step, and every time you walked away more tired than when you started. They walked away exactly the same. This is not a communication failure. It is not your social skills. It is not your patience running out. It is the friction of a deeper mind running against a shallower one, and the cost has been compounding inside you since you were a child. Society tells you that every voice deserves to be heard. They tell you that arguing your case is the mature, civilized thing to do. They tell you that walking away is arrogance. They have been feeding you this since the first time a teacher made you apologize for being right in front of someone who was wrong. It is a lie, not a careless misunderstanding, a deliberate flattening. A culture that pretends every mind is equally capable of reasoning has a hidden function. It keeps the ones who actually can reason exhausting themselves, trying to drag the ones who cannot. Schopenhauer named this nearly 2 centuries ago. Writing in Parerga and Paralipomena, he argued that the world is densely populated by creatures who can wear the costume of reasoning, who can string together sentences and manipulate symbols, but who do not possess the inner equipment to actually think a thought all the way through. He was not being cruel, he was being precise. He was performing the simplest act of intellectual honesty most adults are punished for performing. The friction you have felt your entire life is not a personality defect. It is the cost of being on one side of a structural divide that polite society refuses to admit exists. It is the cost of operating at a frequency the majority cannot receive. You have been taught to apologize for noticing the divide. You have been taught that noticing it makes you arrogant, elitist, cold. You have been taught to perform an equality you do not actually experience. The performance has been costing you something the culture refuses to name, and the bill has been compounding in silence for years. There are 3 concepts that govern the architecture of intelligent isolation. By the end of this video, you will hold the same map Schopenhauer held, the map that explains every exhausting conversation, every unfinished sentence, every moment you swallowed the obvious counter-argument because you knew the room could not metabolize it. The first concept will explain why fighting an idiot is mathematically rigged against you no matter who walks away holding the better argument. The second will explain what those forced engagements have actually been costing you and why the price has been hidden inside your own fatigue. But pay close attention to the third concept. It is the one nobody who has not lived it can hear. It is the truth most intelligent adults carry alone for decades because society has not given them a vocabulary to say it out loud. Once you have a vocabulary, you can never go back to pretending. You will be permanently changed. The Asymmetry Trap. Every time you argue with someone who lacks the cognitive bandwidth to update, you do not lift them, you lower yourself. The act of engagement itself signals that they are operating at your level. They are not, and the audience watching cannot tell the difference. Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler called the underlying mechanism the backfire effect. In their 2010 study published in Political Behavior, they documented what happens when a low-bandwidth mind encounters disconfirming evidence. It does not update, it entrenches. The argument literally makes the other person more wrong, more confidently, with greater conviction than before you opened your mouth. You have been pouring water onto the wrong substance. It is not water absorbent, it never was. This is the geometry of asymmetric epistemic warfare. When they lose nothing, because they were never operating in the same register. When you win, you have spent a finite cognitive resource on a fight that produced zero updating in the other party. You did not bring them up. You brought yourself down into a venue they could occupy. The audience watched you wrestle a pig and concluded only that you were a man who wrestles pigs. Schopenhauer named the structural condition 2 centuries before any social scientist measured it. In Parerga and Paralipomena, he sketched a parable. A group of hedgehogs huddle for warmth in winter. They prick each other with their quills. They pull apart. They freeze. They press closer again. They prick. There is no full closeness without injury. There is no full safety without cold. This is the structural condition of social life for any creature with sharp inner equipment. The hedgehogs that find the right distance survive the season. The ones that insist on full closeness bleed for the comfort of strangers. The intelligent man, Schopenhauer argued, does not resolve this dilemma by becoming warmer. He resolves it by accepting the distance, not as failure, as architecture. Look at the last debate you had with a colleague who had not done the reading. Look at the last time you tried to explain something obvious to a family member who had already built their identity around the opposite position. Did they update? Or did they look at you with the quiet expression of someone who was waiting for you to stop making noise so they could keep believing what they had already decided to believe? You felt the cost. You went home a little smaller, they went home unchanged. This is not your communication failure. It is not your tone. It is not your patience running thin. It is the geometry of an exchange that was rigged before either of you opened your mouth. The contest was not designed to produce updating. It was designed to extract bandwidth from the only participant who possessed any. You must learn the same lesson the hedgehogs learned. You must learn it before another decade of your life has been spent explaining yourself to people who were never going to listen. The optimal distance is not coldness. It is the only position from which warmth can survive without injury. And the external cost, the wasted breath, the lost evening, the audience that misjudged you, is not the worst part of what those engagements have done to you. You now understand the external cost. Every argument is a transaction in which you pay and they receive nothing. But the external cost is not the worst part. There is an internal cost that compounds quietly, decade after decade. It is the reason most intelligent adults are tired in a way that no amount of sleep repairs, and it has a name most psychologists will not say in public. The bandwidth tax. You have a finite cognitive budget. Every day, every hour, every conversation is a withdrawal. The man who argues with idiots is not virtuous. He is a man who has confused the inability to walk away with moral seriousness. Robert MacArthur and Eric Pianka described the underlying mechanism in 1966 in the journal The American Naturalist. Their work formalized what is now called optimal foraging theory. Animals that forage in low-yield patches starve regardless of effort. They are not stupid, they are not lazy. The mathematics of the patch defeats them. The expected return on every minute of foraging falls below the metabolic cost of foraging itself. Your social environment is a foraging patch. Most of the patches you are still working were exhausted a decade ago. You return out of memory, not out of mathematics. The mathematics will not be moved by your loyalty. Schopenhauer wrote a short, furious essay called On Noise, included in the second volume of Parerga and Paralipomena. In it he argued that the man who could not think because of the chatter of lower minds around him was being silently murdered. He was not exaggerating. The death is slow. The death is the version of you that was supposed to exist by now and does not. Cognitive control, attention, and emotional regulation operate on finite daily budgets. Repeated engagement with people who cannot update their models is not just tiring. It cannibalizes the bandwidth you would otherwise spend on the work, the thinking, the loving, and the building that constitute your actual life. The reason intelligent adults often look 15 years older than their less intelligent peers is not stress. It is the accumulated bandwidth tax. Ludwig Wittgenstein lived this. At the height of his international reputation, the most influential philosopher of his generation walked away from a Trinity College professorship at Cambridge. He withdrew to a hut on the Norwegian coast in Skjolden, a cabin he had built with his own hands. Later to the west coast of Ireland, to a stone cottage alone with the weather and his notebooks. He recorded in those notebooks that he could not think in the presence of academic conversation. The atmosphere of clever but shallow exchange was for him physiologically incompatible with the depth he needed to work. He composed philosophical investigations in solitude. He died with the quiet regret that he had spent so many years in rooms full of people who could not follow the silence he needed. He paid the bandwidth tax for 30 years before he stopped paying it. You have been paying it your entire life, and you do not even have the language for what you are losing. Does this sound elitist? Yes. It is also the only honest accounting most adults will ever read of where their last decade went. Look at the people who currently occupy your time. Not the ones you love, the ones who occupy your time. The colleague whose problem you have re-explained 4 times this quarter. The relative whose worldview you have been managing since you were 19. The friend from a decade ago whose conversation has not changed in 8 years. Each of them is taking the bandwidth that would otherwise compound into the version of yourself you have not become. This is the tax. You did not consent to it. Nobody itemized it. It was deducted automatically in increments small enough that you blamed yourself for the deficit. You must run an audit. You must look at the patches and ask how many of them are still yielding. You must accept that loyalty to an exhausted patch is not a virtue. It is the mechanism by which a deeper mind starves itself in public. Here is the tactical application. 2 questions, asked silently before any non-trivial conversation. 1. Does this person have the bandwidth to actually update their position in the time we have? 2. Is the social cost of walking away from this conversation higher than the cognitive cost of staying in it? If the answer to the first question is no, the second question does not matter. You walk away. You do not justify, you do not apologize, you do not deliver a final cutting line. You absorb the small social hit and you preserve the cognitive resource. Every time you run the filter, you save yourself a year of life across a decade. Every time you skip it, the patch takes another withdrawal you did not authorize. This is not avoidance, it is allocation. The Solitude Paradox. This is the section the hook promised. The concept nobody who has not lived it can hear. The truth most intelligent adults carry alone for decades because society has not given them a vocabulary to say it. The deepest part of you is permanently unsharable with most of the people you love. Not because they are bad people, not because they do not love you, because the cognitive register at which you actually live is not a register they can enter. The Solitude Paradox is the simultaneous truth that you can love and be loved by these people fully, and that the most interior part of you will live and die unwitnessed by them. Most people refuse to say this aloud because it feels like a betrayal of love. It is not. It is the architecture of having an inner life that is denser than the social environment you were born into. Dunning-Kruger and David Dunning published The Structural Reason in 1999 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The unable cannot perceive the dimension along which they are unable. The very faculty required to recognize the gap is the faculty that does not exist on the other side. This is not an insult. It is a closed perceptual loop. You cannot reason a person across a wall they cannot see. The pop culture version of this finding has been turned into a punchline. The original finding is not a punchline. It is the mathematical reason competent adults cannot get traction with incompetent ones, and why love itself, no matter how sincere, cannot bridge a perceptual gap that one party is structurally unable to perceive. Isaac Newton spent the plague years of 1665 and 1666 withdrawn to Woolsthorpe Manor, alone in the countryside while Cambridge was closed. In 18 months of total isolation, He produced the foundations of calculus, the new theory of optics, and the first formulations of universal gravitation. His own letters from that period describe a peace he never experienced again in Cambridge. He returned to society. He produced almost nothing comparable for the rest of his life. He had stumbled into the only environment in which his mind could fully extend. The Cambridge of clever but shallow conversation was not a stimulating environment. It was a cage, and Newton spent the rest of his decades inside it because the alternative had no name. Friedrich Nietzsche walked 9 hours a day alone in the mountains around Sils Maria across the 1880s. In those summers he produced Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil. His letters described the relief of being beyond the reach of conversation. He wrote that the village idiot of an alpine hamlet was less corrosive to his thinking than the company of educated men in Berlin and Basel salons. He did not say this to insult villagers. He said it to name what he had finally measured. The educated men were running the closed loop at higher volume. Schopenhauer himself, writing across the second volume of Parerga and Paralipomena, and in his essays on the suffering of the world, argued that the man who has matured into himself can no longer find sufficient interlocutors. He must learn to be his own audience. He must accept that the deepest engagement of his life will be with the silence he keeps and the books he reads, not with the room he sits in. This is not tragedy. It is the geometry of inner life. It is the price paid by anyone whose cognitive ceiling rose above the average ceiling of the rooms they were born into. You have suspected this since adolescence. You have apologized for it. You have hidden it from people who would have been hurt to hear it. You have grieved a closeness you could not name as structurally unavailable, and you have called the grief a defect in yourself. It is not a defect. It is the cost of seeing clearly. They will tell you this sounds arrogant. They will tell you everyone is equally deep if you just listen harder. They will tell you the fact that you cannot share your interior with most adults is a sign of your coldness, not of the structure. Let them. They are running the closed loop. You are not. You must accept the paradox. You must stop apologizing for noticing it. You must stop pretending the unwitnessed part of you does not exist. The silence around it has been costing you the rest of your life. We have dismantled the asymmetry. We have exposed the bandwidth tax. We have named the Solitude Paradox. Now we arrive at the only state that makes the previous three livable, the state most intelligent adults discover in their 40s, after losing a decade of life to engagements that were never going to repay them. The state Schopenhauer named 2 centuries ago, and almost nobody has been allowed to inherit since. The sovereign mind, not the cold mind, not the misanthrope, not the man who has decided to hate the species. The mind that has stopped pretending its depth is a defect, has accepted the limits of who can receive it, and has rebuilt its life around the company that can metabolize it. You now possess 3 things you did not possess before this video. The mathematics that fighting stupidity loses you the contest. The bandwidth accounting that names what repeated engagement has been silently extracting, and the vocabulary for the solitude paradox that has been quietly grieving you for years. The sovereign mind walks away from arguments without justifying. It accepts that some people in its life will only ever access the surface of it and stops grieving that as a failure. It engineers the conditions, physical, social, temporal, under which depth can actually run. It stops apologizing for needing silence, distance, and the company of equals. When you operate from this state, the people who used to drain you cannot reach you the same way. You can love them, you can be civil, you can be present at the meal, at the meeting, at the family table. You will not be rerunning the bandwidth tax for them on a Tuesday afternoon. The architecture is different. They feel it. Most of them will leave on their own. The few who deepen are the few who could always have deepened if you had stopped paying for the rest. Schopenhauer argued that the man who has matured into himself must learn to be his own audience, and in becoming his own audience, he discovers that he is the only audience whose verdict he ever truly needed. The applause of the room was always a substitute for a verdict the room could not issue. Once you know that, you stop performing for it. This is why intelligence isolates, not because intelligent people are antisocial, because depth requires its own environment, and most environments cannot host depth without crushing it. The isolation is not the punishment for being intelligent, it is the precondition of an intelligent life that fully extends. And the sovereign mind state is solitary, not because solitude is the goal, but because solitude is the only patch in which the foraging finally yields. Once it yields, the few who can join you find you. They were never going to find you in the noise. They will call you arrogant, they will call you cold, they will call you elitist. Let them. Their misunderstanding is the price of admission to a life that is finally yours. You walked into this video tired. You walked into it carrying a quiet suspicion you had been carrying for years and had no language for. You walked into it apologizing for being yourself in rooms that could not receive you. You now have the language, you have the asymmetry trap, you have the bandwidth tax, you have the solitude paradox, you have the sovereign mind. You have the same map Schopenhauer held 2 centuries ago, the same map every intelligent adult has had to discover alone, late, and at high cost. The question is whether you will use it, whether you will keep paying the tax to the unupdatable, whether you will keep apologizing for the version of yourself the room cannot metabolize, whether you will keep grieving a closeness that was never structurally available, in rooms that were never going to host the part of you that matters, or whether you will accept the smaller circle, the deeper register, the harder solitude that is also the only environment in which the rest of you can finally exist. This is not arrogance, it is allocation. It is not contempt for the people you love. It is the refusal to keep paying a tax that was extracting the version of you they would have loved most. You can never again claim you did not know. The architecture is in your hands, the map is in your head, and every conversation you have from this moment forward is either an investment in the sovereign mind or another withdrawal from it. You walked in tired, you will not walk out tired in the same way. The fatigue will start to become information, and the leaving, finally, will stop costing you what the staying had been costing you for years. Most people will scroll to the next video, they will absorb the theory and return to paying the tax. They will keep arguing with the same colleagues, the same relatives, the same online interlocutors who have not updated their position in a decade and will not update it tomorrow. They will keep grieving a closeness that was never structurally available. They will tell themselves they are being patient, they will be paying, but somewhere in your life is another mind that should hear this. The friend who has been carrying the same paradox without a vocabulary. The sibling whose intelligence has been costing them peace for years. The colleague who has been quietly walking away from arguments without knowing why and blaming themselves for the walking. Send this to them. Some debts are owed to minds like yours. Some maps are owed to the people you have been quietly recognizing across the room your whole life. I am not asking you to subscribe to anything. I am asking you to forward a frequency. The frequency has been sent from Mindcrypt. Those who can receive it will find the next transmission. Those who cannot will return to the noise. The only question remaining is which one you are.